have to figure out something to do in that one extra week. Don't tell pastor and we can just like have a party or something. They will never know. Let's have a word of prayer and we'll get started. Our Father in heaven, we thank you, Lord, for all you've done for us. We do thank you for the time we have together this morning, for a place to meet. And Lord, I pray that you would bless our time together. I pray you'd be with our church service this morning as well. Be with the preaching. Lord, I pray that you would apply truth to our hearts, that we would apply it to our lives. Lord, that we'd be better followers of you. Lord, I pray that you would be with our whole day. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Lesson 11, we're going to talk about the Revolutionary War, or as I like to refer to it, the American War for Independence. We were fighting for our independence. We weren't, I don't know if we were revolting, kind of, but I'm trying to take control of it. I got it. The American War for Independence. On your handout, it goes a little bit back farther than the slide does. During the first half of the 18th century, persecution of non-establishment. So you're going to see that word establishment if you're looking at history, church history in the colonies. As you're studying this out, if you do any of your own research, the establishment. That is referring to the state church. When it's talking about the establishment, that is the state church. The non-establishment churches' persecution was at a high during the first half of the 18th century. The state church is trying to gain power, trying to keep everyone else from gaining power, and attempts to disrupt baptismal services, establishment clergy. I don't know if I'm going to call them pastors or not because they weren't really acting like pastors, but establishment clergy would ride their horses into the rivers and jeer at those gathering for baptisms. So they would find out where the Baptists were baptizing, and while they were baptizing, they would ride their horses into the water and jeer at them as they're baptizing, ride their horses back and forth, try to make the water muddy. This is what they would do to passive-aggressively persecute the Baptists. Another thing they would do in your handouts, they would at times throw animals, especially dogs. They would throw dead animals into the area where the baptism was taking place. How would you like if we went to baptize someone in our baptismal and someone had thrown a dead animal in it? Pretty rough, because ours is covered. But they would throw animals into, because in their mind, right, what is baptism? It's a whole lot more to them than it is to a Baptist, right? Baptism to them is like salvation. It's like a sacred act, which, yes, we take it seriously, but it's not salvation, right? So they thought they were ruining the whole thing. You know, you can't ever baptize here again. Every baptism that ever happened here is now, polluted. So that's what they were doing. This is what the tricks they were playing to persecute the Baptists and others that were baptizing, but this was obviously a Baptist thing. In Virginia, persecution was especially harsh. Remember, Virginia, we talked about it last week, was an English colony. They were pretty loyal to the king. However, that loyalty stopped at the Toleration Act, and they did not tolerate other religions. The established church was very established. In 1768, 3 Baptist preachers were thrown in jail for 43 days. Another 4 men, William Weber, John Waller, James Greenwood, and Robert Ware, you can look up all of those names. They were thrown into a filthy prison. So they would actually keep these prisons dirty for this kind of a punishment. And they were notoriously infested with fleas. They had thrown him in there for 46 days. What do you think happened to the Baptist church under this kind of persecution? What happens to the church, a true church, under persecution? And what? It grows. Yeah. They couldn't stop it. And they didn't learn from history. When you start persecution, you turn anything into a martyr. People just flock to it, right? While in prison, they would preach through the bars. So of course, you've probably seen this in history books or in, depicted where the preacher's in jail preaching through the bars. They would actually do that. They preached through the bars. Their congregations would come. At least they would try to provide some for their pastor if they could, give them food, clothes, stuff like that, bare minimums. But they would preach through the bars of the prison. They would try to ride in front of the prison to stop the crowd from being able to hear. They would build walls in front of the prison so that they couldn't hear through. So they would have to preach over the walls, and many of them did lift their voice and holler over the walls. On some occasions, pastor was released to give the jails rest from the crowds gathered to hear the preaching. They're like, just get the guy out of here, please, so that we don't have to listen to his preaching all day, every day. Because the congregations would come and say, hey, we're here, can you preach a sermon to us? So a lot of persecution is going on. This is all leading up to the American War for Independence. Due to the persecutions in Virginia, the Baptist Church grew, and by 1774, in Virginia, there were over 55 Baptist churches in the colony. Where it was illegal to be a Baptist, you would go to jail if you were a Baptist pastor caught preaching and baptizing. But because of this persecution, there were over 55 Baptist churches in the colony. Was it working? No, it was strengthening the Christians that were there. And they were clinging harder to their faith because they believed in the truth. The British Toleration Act of 1699 was finally, okay, this is 1774, back in 1699 we talked about the Toleration Act, was finally, though not entirely, recognized by Virginia in 1768. So they're like, okay, legally we can't persecute them because the king says we can't. But they were doing things like disrupting their baptismal services passive-aggressively as much as they could persecute the Baptists. The Baptist associations, so we talked about some of those associations last week, they started to play an important role because it was a large group of Baptists. And so the Philadelphia Association was involved in a lot of stuff going on in Virginia. The Charleston Association was another large Baptist association that was involved, and they were starting to throw their weight around, if you want to put it that way, saying, hey, all the Baptists in Virginia, if we can get together on this and write petitions and agree on some things, then we can maybe make some differences in our nation. So the Baptist associations began sending petitions to the government, the House of Burgesses, for religious liberty. Remember in Virginia, that was really the first self-governing body there in Virginia, the House of Burgesses. And remember that from history, the House of Burgesses? Okay, good. Some of you do. Hallelujah. I taught history, so this is like, I'm like, yes, history. The bill was drafted, this is in your handout, but a bill was drafted. They actually started writing a bill for religious toleration, religious liberty in Virginia, in the House of Burgesses. They started writing it, but unfortunately this little thing called the Revolutionary War happened, and it got disrupted, the bill, the House of Burgesses, that whole governing body. Because of that, it never officially passed into law in Virginia. It was drafted, it never became law because the Revolutionary War happened. The American War for Independence brought an interesting separation. This is in your handout. It brought an interesting separation. Oh, did I have that on that? No. It brought an interesting separation based on religious persuasion in the colonies. So, what side do you think the Baptists were on? What side do you want the Baptists to be on? Right, we want to be on the American side, right? We're like fighting for independence. Yes, the Baptists were on the American colony side of the War for Independence, right? Yes, go Baptists. We won. So who do you think was on the other side? Who do you think was clinging to the old way of doing things? Right, the Church of England. The established church was like, hey, if we lose this thing, we lose our power here. So many of the clergy, the leadership of the establishment churches, were pro-English government because that's what was propping up their authority in the colonies. Most of their congregations were not. There's a story, I'm not sure how true it is. I believe it's true. That was recorded in the book that I'm reading through. And one clergyman was preaching a sermon to his congregation on how great the English monarchy was and English rule was in his sermon. Sounds a little political, but anyways. And they took the clergy out and strapped him to a tree and lashed him 39 times. Well, word got out that this was happening, so another Church of England clergyman, I don't know if he was Church of England, brought a pair of pistols to the pulpit while he was preaching, and he set them in plain view on the pulpit and said, look, I'm going to preach on how great the King of England is and how great the monarchy is and the rule of England is, and if you try to take me out, I've got pistols here to protect myself. This is what was going on in the churches. How would you like, I'm going to preach on, no one likes it, but here's what I'm going to preach on, and if you don't like it, I've got pistols. Pretty interesting. I've definitely never preached with a pistol sitting on the pulpit while I was preaching. I don't believe I think Pastor Chamberlain told me he's never preached with a pistol on the pulpit either. Thankfully, I've never had to, right? And you shouldn't if you're preaching the truth, but these people weren't preaching the truth. They were mixing a lot of politics with the truth. And the reason for that is they liked the authority they held. Of course, they were making out pretty well as well, money-wise, being able to control all of that. So they didn't like the idea of independence from England. It was propping up their wonderful little world that they had established over here. At the time of the start of the American War for Independence, Episcopalians, Congregationalists, Presbyterians, these were the dominant state churches in the colonies. If you drive around New England, what churches do you see everywhere? Okay? A congregational church is in almost every town, and the building was built in like 1653, right? Way back, who knows when. This is why they were the established churches. Almost every New England town somewhere at some point had a congregational church. There are a lot of Episcopalian churches as well. You'll see a lot of them. A lot of Presbyterian churches. Depends on the colonies in New England. Most of it was Congregationalists, hence the reason we have so many of them up here. They were the dominant state churches in the colonies. So you have this separation from, the free thinkers, right? People who want freedom, not just freedom from England, freedom from the monarchy. They want religious freedom. They want separation of church and state. These are the people who are saying, hey, we've got to do something about this persecution that's coming from not the establishment only, but from the monarchy. Of course, these are the men who were drafting the Declaration of Independence, who were drafting all of the constitutions that led up to the constitution that we're under right now. All of these men were part of that. And of course, the clergy didn't like that. Also, what plays into this is Catholicism. So I'm not trying to harp on Catholicism. It tends to happen a lot, but I'm not trying to harp on it. But newsflash: Catholicism is false. It's a false religion. So I don't think there's anything wrong with calling them out, right? Read the Bible, you'll find out it's a false religion. But the King of England, King George III, was very friendly with the Pope. Okay, so we've come a long ways from Henry VIII saying, hey, no more Catholic Church in England, right? And establishing the Church of England. So now we've moved forward. George III, who's now the King of England, is friendly with the Pope. His brother, two of his brothers, their names are flying my memory at the moment, they were accepted into the court with the Pope. He gave them commendations. If you remember, who did the King of England, George III, who did he hire to fight in the Revolutionary War? Because the British Army themselves, they didn't really want to fight, because who were they fighting against? Their own countrymen, right? They saw the colonies as Englishmen. So many of the English didn't want to fight in the colonies, so who did the King of England hire? The Hessians, who were Germans. A little news, a little history tidbit. You remember the crossing of the Delaware River? The British didn't celebrate Christmas. So, you know, George Washington knew that the Germans were celebrating Christmas. And so he said, hey, let's go get them while they're partying. Pretty ingenious. But he took advantage of the fact that the Germans celebrated Christmas. The English didn't. It wasn't an English holiday. So he attacked them while they were celebrating Christmas. I think it's kind of funny. Anyways, the Germans were Catholics. The Hessians that they hired, they were Catholics. They had a little bit of a vendetta against the colonies because almost all of the colonies had anti-papal or Catholic rhetoric in their constitutions, in their founding documents. They were against Catholicism. So you think the Catholics had a little bit of like, if we help the king, maybe we can have a little bit of a toehold here in the colonies. You also have Quebec. I don't know if you pronounce it Quebec, right? Okay, because we're Americans. We can pronounce it however we want. But if you go to Quebec, it's supposed to be pronounced Quebec. If you speak French, you're supposed to say Quebec, right? So you have Quebec, or Quebec, however you want to pronounce it, was at one point thought to be the 14th colony in the New World. And it was allowed to be French, and it was allowed to be Catholic. The French country of France was Catholic. So Quebec was allowed to be a French colony. So you have that playing into it as well. A lot of that had to do with, a lot of it played into the beginning of the Revolutionary War. So the Catholics were on the side of the English. Of course, the established churches, the clergy, the leadership was on the side of the English. So you almost have, it wasn't a religious war where, you know, we're going to war religiously. However, you do have this separation in the War for Independence of, hey, here's the Baptists on one side, the Quakers. I don't think the Quakers were involved because they were pacifists. But they definitely were not Tories. They were not for England. So you have them on that side, and then you have the established church. You have the Catholic Church on the other side. It wasn't Catholics versus Baptists, but it very much could have been, and if you look at the dividing line there based on religious persuasion, it was. So you have that interesting separation. Of course, I think it's interesting, the Baptists, right, were fairly free thinkers. We like to have that freedom of religion. We like to have that liberty in Christ as Baptists. We believe in that. We've talked about that. That's one of our core principles that the Baptists believe in, live by, right? So you have the Catholics, the established church, they were largely on the British side, while the nonconformist churches, such as Baptists, were on the side of the colonies. After the colonist victory, many of the established clergy fled back to England. They said, okay, we're getting out of here because now they're going to come after us. We were against them. Baptists were among the first religious bodies to recognize the Continental Congress. Okay, go back into American history. Remember the Continental Congresses, where they're getting together. They're saying, hey, there's an issue. We need to figure out this stuff. We need to raise an army. If we are going to declare independence, who's going to be in charge of that? Those are all the Continental Congresses. So the Baptists were among the first to recognize the authority of the Continental Congress. A Baptist convention from Massachusetts sent Isaac Backus with a letter of resolve to the Congress. They said, hey, look, if we're going to do this, if you're really going to declare independence, the Baptists are with you. We're ready to fight. We're ready to take up arms. We will stand with you. So they sent a letter via Isaac Backus to the Continental Congress and said, hey, we're here, we're on your side, and we will stand with you. The Baptists, among the first to recognize that. Let's see, I think we went through all of that. Most of the Catholics were on the side of the British, the German mercenaries. Long he hired Irish Catholics as well. Those were fighting the colonists. Many Baptists joined the Continental Army, and several regularly preached to the army. So many of the men that joined, a lot of the chaplains in the military or the Continental Army were Baptists. A lot of them were Baptists. A lot of clergy, Baptist pastors, stood up in front of their congregation and said, hey, we need to go fight and stand up for liberty. And many of them took many people from their congregation and went and joined the Continental Army. There were several units, that's what they called them, units in the Continental Army that were made up largely of Baptists that fought in the Revolutionary War, or the War for Independence. Rhode Island which was reported to be 2/3 Baptist. That'd be pretty cool if we could say our state was 2/3 Baptist, right? I don't know if we can. Rhode Island could, because it's pretty small. Rhode Island, which was 2/3 Baptist, they sent their own Declaration of Independence to George III. They said, hey, we're going to get out in front of this thing. It's coming down the pike anyways, but we're just going to say it because it needs to be said. They sent their own Declaration of Independence on May the 4th. I think that was a Star Wars reference. But May the 4th, 1776. Sorry, it's, May the 4th be with you, right? Okay, there we go. You guys, any Star Wars fans in here? Okay. Christian Star Wars fans, right? Good. But they sent a Declaration of Independence to George III. Of course, all the Baptists are like, hey, we're done with England. We're done with the king. We're independent. I think it's kind of interesting that they sent that. How many of you have ever heard of the Rhode Island Declaration of Independence? Pretty small piece of history. But they said, we're declaring our independence. The Baptists of Virginia sent a memorial to the House of Burgesses. Of course, you have all the colonial government gearing up with their local militias. The Baptists of Virginia, they sent that memorial offering Baptist soldiers for resisting the British in 1775. Of course, we're on a pretty steep slope to the War for Independence at this point. During the war, several Baptists were prominent chaplains. Again, these are some names you can look up. These are in your handout on the screen as well. William McClanahan was a Baptist minister with a small militia made up of mostly Baptists. So this guy actually had a militia of his own. Sounds like a good Baptist, right? He had a militia of his own that was made up largely of Baptists. And he joined the Continental Army. He led them into battle with Baptists. John Hart, this is a pretty interesting part of American history. He was a wealthy landowner in New Jersey. He was elected to the Continental Congress. He signed the Declaration of Independence. So if you can go look at the signers of the Declaration of Independence, his name, John Hart, is on there. He signed it. By the way, the signers of the Declaration of Independence, they weren't people that had nothing to lose. They had a lot to lose. Many of them were very wealthy, had a lot going on, and they didn't need to be a part of it. They were doing well, but they signed the Declaration of Independence. Many of them, I encourage you, it's not really part of Baptist history, but John Hart was one of them. Many of them lost everything because they signed the Declaration of Independence. They knew exactly what they were doing when they signed the Declaration of Independence as well. Of course, we know John Hancock said, hey, I'm going to sign my name big enough so that the King of England doesn't need his spectacles to read it, right? John Hart was one of those men who signed the Declaration of Independence. In 1747, he gave some of his land to the Hopewell Baptist Congregation, a church, you can look it up, look up Hopewell Baptist Congregation, a church that was in operation until 1974 and is recognized as one of the earliest Baptist churches in America. The land is still there. There's quite a bit of history to it. There's a church meeting house there. The Hopewell Old School Baptist Meeting House. How do you like that name? We're Old School Baptists, right? You can look it up. It's in New Jersey. I believe there's a meeting house there. I don't know. I don't think it's the original one. He lost most of his fortune, his wife and children in the war, and he himself died before the end of the war, one of the signers of the Declaration. Pretty sad ending, but here was a man, most people believe he was a Baptist. Again, he never was like, hey, I'm a Baptist. He never put a Baptist flag over his house. However, he donated that land for the Hopewell Old School Baptist Meeting House. At one time, he had a very large tract of land there in New Jersey. At one time during the war, he actually invited George Washington and the Continental Army, and they came. They took him up on the invitation, and they camped on his farm and had their whole military there for a while on his farm around that area where he had donated land for a Baptist church. The Constitution of 1787, by the way, that's the Constitution that we're under right now. I put it that way in case we have some history buffs who are like, wait, there was other constitutions. Yes, there were other constitutions. George Washington technically wasn't the first president of the United States, but he was the first president under our current Constitution. You can look up there are other presidents before him, but not under this Constitution. Constitution of 1787's ratification depended on Massachusetts and Virginia. So it came down to these two states. The other states ratified it. You remember there's quite a bit of drama between the end of the War for Independence and the Constitution with some of the, you have some the other founding documents. They weren't as well written or as well put together. They were kind of drawn up quickly, sort of experimental. It didn't work out, and finally we got together and drafted a constitution that worked, and I believe still works, but depended on Massachusetts and Virginia. There was a little bit of hesitation over it. It faced a lot of opposition because it had no religious text in it. So if you read through the Constitution, I'd encourage you, if you haven't, to read through the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution. It's a good read if you like legal documents. But it's a good thing to read, good thing to have a little bit of a working knowledge of. It faced a lot of opposition because it didn't have any religious text in it. They're like, hey, it's not religious enough. We should have like church in there. We should have more religion in the Constitution. I don't believe that. Personally, it's a governing document, right? We believe in separation of church and state. But it faced a lot of opposition because the mindset of the day in 1787 was everyone should be in church. Everyone should be a believer. It's just part of who we are. And it was largely that way in 1787, but they didn't want it to be a religious establishing document. So they wrote it the way they wrote it, so it wasn't a religious establishing document, right? So it faced a lot of opposition. Massachusetts and Virginia, was it Virginia? I'm thinking it was, sorry, I'm trying to find my place in my notes. Yeah, Massachusetts and Virginia. There was a large amount of Baptists in Virginia who said, "Hey, pump the brakes. There's no religious text. There's also no separation of church and state in the Constitution. If you read through it, there's no separation of church and state. That would come later with the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. There was no separation of church and state, so it faced a lot of opposition there as well. Well, there's no separation of church and state. There's not enough religious text in it. And so a lot of people were a little bit hesitant about ratifying it. Came down to Massachusetts and Virginia. Several Baptist members of the ratification delegation in Massachusetts were Baptists. There were Baptist pastors, Baptist members who were part of ratifying the Constitution that is in effect in the United States today. Several Baptists were involved in saying, hey, this is the document we want to build our nation on. I think that's pretty cool that Baptists were there at the very beginning. They were convinced by a man named James Manning. He was the president of Rhode Island College. We call that, what college is that now? Brown University. He was the president to vote to ratify the Constitution. He heard that they were voting to ratify the Constitution. He went there to the delegation to ratify it, and he gave them a little pep talk and said, hey, we need to ratify this. And while he was there, they asked him, a Baptist pastor who was in charge of a Baptist seminary, to stand and pray over the delegates to help them make the right decision before the final vote was taken. So part of the final ratification vote to ratify the U.S. Constitution that's in effect today was largely affected by a Baptist pastor who stood up and said, hey, this is the document that we need to ratify, and we all need to vote to ratify it. And then he would pray over that as the final vote was taken. It was ultimately ratified in Massachusetts, and they were largely convinced by James Manning, who was a Baptist in charge of a Baptist seminary. Imagine if a Baptist showed up in Congress to try to convince people to vote. By the way, a little bit of encouragement. There are Baptists in Congress today, and we met several of them when we were down there. And I'm like, wait, this guy's like a fundamental independent Baptist. His dad's a pastor. I'm like, what? And he's in Congress. And it's pretty interesting. I think that's a little encouraging for me to know that there's Baptists still involved in Congress today. Depending on Virginia as well, Virginia was a little bit more hesitant. There was a little bit of a run to be a delegate between James Madison and John Leland. James Madison was not a Baptist, but John Leland was. So John Leland was a Baptist pastor. He ran to be a delegate to the ratification, to ratify the Constitution. He had the backing of the Baptists in Virginia. And because of that, it was splitting the vote to who would be the delegate. John Leland finally said, hey, James Madison's our man. I'm going to quit the race so that James Madison can be our delegate. He believed James Madison would vote correctly. Madison ultimately was backed by John Leland and the Baptists of Virginia, and ultimately it was ratified. We know that, right? The Constitution's still there. The same Baptist clergyman, John Leland, prepared a petition to President Washington for an amendment, sound familiar, to the Constitution protecting religious liberty. He said, hey, we need something to protect religious liberty. You remember, many states were hesitant about ratifying. They said, now hold on, it's missing some things. And the delegate said yes, the authors said yes, it's missing some things, but we can add to it, right? They made the availability there to amend it, to add to it. And of course, they said as soon as it's ratified, then we can amend it and add to it. They didn't want to go back in and rewrite the whole document. So as soon as it was ratified, they started working on that Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. But it was planted, the seed of that Bill of Rights was planted in the mind of President Washington by a Baptist pastor whose name was John Leland in Virginia. He said, hey, we need protection for religious liberty in our founding document for our nation. A Baptist pastor wrote a letter to President Washington. July 8, 1789, James Madison, who supported James Madison as the delegate, John Leland, supported by the Virginia Baptists, proposed the First Amendment, which, what is the First Amendment? Freedom of religion, right? Freedom of speech, but freedom of religion as well. James Madison, largely influenced by John Leland and the Baptists of Virginia, said, hey, let's propose this First Amendment, the very first amendment to the U.S. Constitution for freedom of religion. Congress shall establish no religion, right? Because the Baptists said, we want freedom of religion. We just fought for freedom in our nation, and we want freedom of religion. And because of that, we have the First Amendment, but it was the first of 10 because the Baptists. In your handout, I believe that's the end. In your handout, John Leland, a Baptist pastor, along with the Virginia, sent a petition to President George Washington for religious liberty amendment to the Constitution with support from the Virginia Baptists. James Madison proposed the First Amendment on July 8, 1789. So in the fabric of our founding document and the fabric of the founding of our nation and in the fighting of the war for independence, where were the Baptists? They were there. They were fighting. They were pressing for religious liberty. They were proposing amendments. They were backing men who they knew were going to make the right decision. They were convincing men to vote to ratify the Constitution. Why? Because they saw it as necessary for freedom of religion. And I'm thankful to be a Baptist because we have a pretty great heritage in the United States of America for our small part in how we play to really shape the nation that we live in today. I think it's pretty cool. But any questions, comments, additions, little tidbits of history you know that I don't know? I'm sure there's plenty of it. Any, like, wow, I didn't know that? Shock? Yes, I knew that. You're welcome.
If anyone's interested, though, there's a book called Signing Their Lives Away, and it's about all the signers of the Declaration of Independence and what they suffered and how they sacrificed. It's a really good read. It's a small book, but a good one.
Of course, I'm an American, so I like American history, right? If you're American, you should like American history. That's my opinion. So yeah, I study American history. I enjoy American history. I'm a patriot, you know, right? I love America. I like the American flag, all of that, right? So the Constitution, you should read it, right? You should have a little bit of a working knowledge of what's in there. The amendments, you should read those. You should know what the Constitution is. Read the Declaration of Independence. I'd encourage you, if you have the opportunity, go to Washington, D.C., go to the memorials, the buildings there. It is absolutely amazing. Go to the Statue of Liberty if you have the opportunity. And it just, it'll do your heart good to see what our founding fathers said religiously. I'm sorry, they try hard to erase it, but they just absolutely can't because it's literally engraved in stone at our nation's capital. What they said about religion. And, you know, go to the back of some of the buildings, go downstairs in some of the buildings, and it's amazing what they were Christians. They believed in the same God that we believed in. No, they weren't Baptists. A lot of them weren't Baptists. But they were Christians like you and I are Christians. It's pretty encouraging that that's there and it's allowed to be there. It kind of has to be there, right? But anything else? Nothing. Marvelous. It's 9:41, so we're exactly on time, about 4 minutes early. But you are dismissed. We'll be on lesson 12 next week.